I don't have slides. I coach organizations on the strange, new, emerging discipline of business storytelling. And I write books about it, latest book. And I take people on how to tackle the most difficult leadership challenges in organizations. How do you spark change? How do you build trust? How do you get people collaborating together? How do you get people leading people into the future? These are the most difficult challenges, and as it happens, narrative techniques are well suited to these particular challenges, whereas conventional command and control techniques not really suited to them at all. And I'm going to be talking mainly about innovation, not so much about invention, not so much about how you come up with an idea, but really what happens after you have an idea. We've heard a number of people have had great ideas. Charlie Cannon's kids, Taffy, she has a great idea, but how do you create the will to change? You have the great idea. How do you get people to want to change when they actually don't seem to want to change, when they're preoccupied with other things? I would say that is the central question, the central dilemma in innovation. How do you create demand? Supply of ideas is there. How do you create demand? And I got into this strange subject in February 1996 when I was working in the World Bank, a big international lending organization located in Washington, D.C. And how did I get there? Well, I was born in Sydney, Australia. I grew up there. I studied psychology and law at Sydney University. I worked as a lawyer in a law office in Sydney. And then I went to Oxford University in England. I studied some more law. And then I joined the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And I was a very left-brained kind of person. Clear, crisp, succinct, bottom line, that was me. And as you know, big organizations love that kind of person. So I climbed up the managerial ladder in the World Bank. And by February 1996, I was actually the director of the Africa region. The Africa region, the World Bank handles about a third of the operations of the World Bank. So I was beginning to think, well, this is a pretty important kind of position. But then as things happen in big organizations, the scene abruptly changed. The president of the World Bank suddenly died, and my boss unexpectedly retired, and somebody else was appointed to my position. So I could see things not going too well for me now in the World Bank. So I went to see the top management and said, do you have anything in mind for me? They said, not really, not really. It happens in organizations. But I pressed them a bit, and eventually they said, okay, Steve, why don't you go and look into information? Now, information in the World Bank in February 1996 had the status of like the garage or the cafeteria. So I was not exactly being offered a promotion. I was being sent to Siberia. But I was kind of interested in information, and I went and looked at information, and I seemed familiar. Oh, many of you, we were drowning in information all over the place, couldn't find anything, wasting a ton of money on this. And obviously, we had to clean this mess up, and if we cleaned it up, we'd save a lot of money, but we would still be the same kind of clunky, slow-moving, old-fashioned lending organization. People all around the world were asking, does the world actually need a slow-moving, clunky, old-fashioned lending organization? The private sector is now providing all this finance to developing countries. Let's close the World Bank down. Whole global movement, let's close the World Bank down. Simply making this organization more efficient wasn't going to solve our problem. So I had another thought. Why don't we share our knowledge? We in the World Bank had tremendous breadth and depth of expertise in all sorts of difficult subjects. Agriculture, banking, finance, education, health, you name it. I mean, tremendous wealth and breadth and depth of expertise, but it was very difficult to find this out. If you knew somebody in the World Bank and you knew what they knew and you knew them well enough to have lunch with them, you could actually find out what the World Bank knew about a subject. But if you didn't have that kind of access, you're in trouble. And if you're outside the organization, didn't really stand a chance. So I said, why don't we reverse that? Why don't we make it very easy for anyone to find out what we know? Then we could actually be a pretty interesting organization, even exciting organization. Let's become a knowledge-sharing organization. And I thought this was a pretty good idea. And I'm now, as you see, in the archetypal situation of the innovator. I have a better mousetrap, and I'm about to try to persuade one of the world's most change-resistant organizations to change. And I'm also in the process kind of being booted out of the organization. When I ask a business school class, what are my chances of pulling this off? 0. I have no chance of pulling this off. And they're right if I was pursuing conventional command and control techniques to communication. But that's not exactly what happened. So I started to persuade my colleagues, let's become a knowledge-sharing organization. And their initial response to me was quite decisive. It was, Steve, this is the World Bank. We're a bank. We lend money. That's what pays your salary. Keep your eye on the ball. We are a lending organization. It didn't seem to work too well. I said, well, how do consultants persuade organizations to change? They have these wonderful 2x2 matrices of boxes and arrows. But I got out these charts, and I tried those, and people just looked dazed. And I gave people reason, and they didn't listen. And then I stumbled on something else. I'll be talking about the future and the future of the World Bank, and what's it going to be like? Well, I said it's going to be like today. Let me tell you about something that happened just a few months ago. In June 1995, and still in early 1996, in June 1995, a health worker in a little village in Zambia in Africa logged onto the website for the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, and got the answer to a question on how to treat malaria. Now, that was June 1995, not June 2015. This wasn't the capital of Zambia. It was a little village 600 kilometers away. And this is not a rich country. This is Zambia, one of the poorest countries of the world. But you know the most important part of this picture for us in the World Bank? The World Bank is not in this picture. The World Bank does not have its knowledge organized to share with all the millions of people who make decisions about poverty. But just imagine if we did. Just imagine if we got organized. Think what an organization we could become. And yeah, that started to resonate first with staff, and then managers, and then senior managers. And then the president of the World Bank heard about it, and he said, right, let's do it. He went to the annual meeting of the World Bank, October 1, 1996, huge public occasion, 170 finance ministers, all their entourages, massive public occasion, and he announced, we are going to do this. We are going to share our knowledge with the world. We are going to become the knowledge bank. And when the people who'd sent me to Siberia just a few months before this announcement heard this announcement, they were horrified because this was the worst case scenario. This was the nightmare they'd been worried about, and now it was happening because now the man from Siberia was back. And not only back, but had someone managed to co-opt a whole group of staff and managers, and now even the president to pursue this crazy idea of becoming a knowledge-sharing organization. So this wasn't the end of the war. This was just the beginning of the war. This is when they started to use real bullets instead of rubber bullets, because now there was a risk this thing that might actually happen. And the next 4 years were a whole set of battles and struggles as to whether we were going to implement what the president had already announced we were going to implement, and if so, what it was going to look like. And I found, to my great astonishment, that it was only a story that enabled me to win those battles. When I didn't tell a story, I lost. When I told a story, I won. And so I kept surprise telling stories. And by the year 2000, the World Bank was being benchmarked as one of the world's most admired knowledge enterprises. The World Bank had never been the most admired anything before. So people were asking me, what were you doing to this organization, this slow-moving, clunky organization? What meat were you feeding this beast? And I had to confess that it was this very ancient technology of storytelling being used for modern purposes. And I was invited to write a book, so I wrote a book, and in the process discovered that it's not just any story. We're not talking about the kind of stories that people tell fairy stories to kids in libraries, or it's not about people sitting around the corporate campfire and chewing the gossip of the organization. This is purposeful storytelling, it's kind of storytelling which has a particular pattern, and if you understand the pattern, you can find the right story to tell easily, and you won't make the mistake of choosing the wrong pattern. There are different patterns for different purposes, and the kind of pattern that you need for a story to spark change, to get people to innovate, to buy into an innovation that they're not particularly interested in getting involved in, persuade people who don't want to be persuaded, is what I've called a springboard story, a story that can communicate a complex idea and spark people into action. And it has a number of central characteristics. Let me just mention a couple of them. It needs to be a true story. It needs to be positive in tone. It needs to be told in a minimalist fashion, and it leads to action. Let me say just a little bit about each of these. This is a true story. It's about something that actually happened. Go to Zambia, check it out. You can find, yeah, it actually happened. And people will go to Zambia and check it out. And if you have made it up, if it's not correct, and people come back and say, it didn't happen, don't worry, we don't need to worry about knowledge management anymore, it destroys the whole point. And I never had any success with imaginary stories. Imagine what the World Bank would be like if it started to share its knowledge. The answer to that would be, you know, Steve, that's not going to happen here. It's, you know, the World Bank, slow-moving, change-resistant, it's not going to happen here. And that's the end of this discussion unless I can say, but it did happen here, and here's the very person it happened to. Check it out. This actually happened. It's the truth of the story that actually shakes people out of their complacency and makes them think, yeah, if it did happen here, maybe it could happen elsewhere. And it has to be not just a story that's factually accurate as far as it goes. It has to be a story that's authentically true. So that when people do go and check it out, they say, oh, yeah, that's pretty much what happened. An example of a story that's factually accurate as far as it goes but has a little problem is the following. 700 happy passengers reached New York after the Titanic's maiden voyage. End of story. Now, if you tell a story in that particular pattern, because when people find out, if they don't already know, the ship sank and 1,500 people drowned, then there's massive, massive backlash on the story and the storyteller. But the ironic thing is, if you look around big organizations, you find Titanic stories all over many of those organizations. Just people painting a rosy picture of some scene, but just around the corner, just below the surface, some horrible detail, they are backlash on the story, the storyteller immense. Second thing, it needs to be a positive story. Hollywood's right, it has to have a happy ending. If you're trying to spark action, it has to have a happy ending. Different if you're trying to share knowledge and for other purposes, but if you're trying to get action, it has to have a happy ending. And the reasons for this come out of neuroscience. I mean, the last couple of hundred years, a lot of attention being paid on the human brain, the cortex, but more recently, a lot of attention being paid on the mammal brain. It's just under the human brain. And below that, the reptile brain, which we all have. And these mammal reptile brains, the limbic system, they're not very smart, but they are very quick. And they are useful for something, because when you're driving along the highway and not paying very much attention to what's going on, and something comes in front of you, then it's these little gadgets that say, wake up, something happening, something bad is happening, do something. And yeah, you may wake up, and so you may survive. But they're useful for some things, but in storytelling they have some drawbacks, because if you're telling a story with a negative tone about a firm that went bankrupt because they did not implement knowledge management, then what happens, these little gadgets, reptile brain, jump into action and start saying, wake up, something bad is happening. And the human brain can intervene and say, now calm down, reptile brain. We may actually learn something from this instructive experience. And the human brain will generally win that debate. But does the person rush out into action? No, they're recovering from another encounter with the reptile brain. But if, on the other hand, you tell a story about about the firm that solved its problem and got the answer and moved into the future, then what seems to be happening is that the limbic system provides what's called an endogenous opiate reward to the cortex that basically injects a substance called dopamine into parts of the cortex and creates a mild sense of euphoria, kind of warm and floaty feeling, kind of wonderful feeling that you have after you've seen a great movie. Wow, I feel terrific. Change the organization? No problem, let's do it. Perfect frame of mind if you're trying to get people to do something a bit unusual. And the third characteristic is that it is a story told in a very strange way. It's told in a minimalist fashion. It's very unlike, quite the opposite of the story told by an entertainment storyteller who would give you the sights and the sounds and the smells of what it was like in Zambia. I mean, I was talking about a health worker in Zambia. Was that a man or a woman? Was it a nurse or a doctor? Was it hot? Was it cold? Was it wet? Was it dry? I didn't tell you anything about Zambia. I didn't actually want you thinking about Zambia. I wanted you thinking about your own situation, and maybe I've got knowledge. Maybe I could have a website. And the mechanism underlying this is the following, that there are actually two listeners for every person in the audience. Look out at the audience, and it looks like there's one listener per person. No, there's two. There's the listener you see, and there's also the little voice in the head. And we all know, of course, what the little voice in the head is, but if you are sitting there and wondering to yourself, well, I wonder what Steve means by the little voice in the head. That's the little voice I mean. The little voice that you hear all day, every day in your life, a huge part of communication, because I might be talking about something that happened in Zambia, and that little voice is going, well, you've got all these emails. You should never have come to this presentation. You should be back. Maybe totally drowning out everything I'm saying. And so what you do is you tell the story in this minimalist fashion so that there's a whole lot of mental space in the mind for the listener to imagine a new future. And that's the key to innovation. It has to be the listener's idea. If it remains my idea, it's no use. It's simply my idea coming at the listeners like a missile. It's when the listener creates the idea. They've just had a wonderful idea. Wow. And it's their idea. That's what creates the energy. That's what creates the dynamism. That's what creates the movement forward to take people into the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you.